Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Paul from Thinking Christian, and today I want to continue our discussion on simulation theology by talking about simulation incarnation or incarnation. So in the last video, we talked about miracles and naturalism. So the idea of miracles as an analogy being a simulator kind of tinkering around with the simulation to achieve some specific end. In this particular case, we may talk a little bit about incarnation. Can the simulator actually incarnate himself in some particular way into the simulation or put part of himself in there to do some specific task? So this could be seen in some ways as a way of interfacing with the simulation to perform such miracles, but it could also answer the question of, can the simulator show up inside the simulation, which is very similar, if you think about it, to the incarnation of Jesus for Christians. So let's go ahead and get started. It's going to be difficult because we don't need a definition of a strict definition of incarnation to do this. We don't need it to be super precise. All I need to do is construct this analogy that'll hopefully get you to think about these things in a kind of different, interesting sort of way. And the main question we're asking here is it possible for me to incarnate myself into my own simulation? Now, to give an analogy, before you answer this question, I want you to think of a bionic arm, and I want you to think of this in 3 different steps. So imagine my arm gets chopped off by some accident, and I receive a bionic arm, which, as you can see basically here in the pictures, it interfaces with my brain. And when I think about moving my arm up, instead of a stub, I have a bionic arm that moves up. So this makes sense. This actually, this arm is attached to me, and I think it would be fair to say that this arm would be an extension of my body. This this bionic arm is actually an extension of my body because it serves the same purpose, say, as a normal arm that is not bionic. It's just made of different materials. But one of the things that's interesting about this bionic arm is we can take these signals, these electrical signals that are coming from my brain, and rather than directly interfacing with the arm, what I can do is put a transmitter on the stub and a receiver on the bionic arm, and now I can move this bionic arm 10 to 15 feet away. And I still can think, okay, raise my arm, except this time when I'm raising my arm, I'm raising the arm that's 10 or 15 feet away. And I think if you think about this, is it still fair to say this arm is an extension of my body? And I think so. I think it's fair to say, yes, this arm is an extension of my body. Just because I have moved it, from directly being away from me all the way across the room doesn't all of a sudden make it so that I'm not mentally controlling it. So my argument here is that mental control, the ability that mental states have causal impact on things, is what allows them to basically be an extension of our body, like any of their body parts. It's not that it's just directly attached, because at some point, you could imagine just having wires and moving the whole thing 10 feet away. Is it the fact that it's wireless? If it's wireless, it's no longer my arm. It gets into all of these really interesting details. So my argument is, yes, this is still an extension of your body, even though the arm is 15 feet away. And thinking about this, suppose I didn't even have the bionic arm at all. I just had the transmitter on my, where my arm would be. And I now have an arm in a virtual world, in like a 3-dimensional environment. And I think about moving my arm, and the arm in the virtual world moves its hand and arm up. And we ask the same question: is this arm an extension of my body? And if so, if this is a fair way to see it, is it possible that when I play a video game, when I'm playing a game or running a simulation where I can walk around using the arrow keys or something, that this, the body parts of this virtual thing is somewhere an extension of myself? I think that's the real question. So we have examples of this in a lot of different games. This is going to show you guys how old I am. This is Black Ops 2. And the idea behind Black Ops 2, and they're these strike force missions, and basically what happens is you can direct your soldiers to go around and do specific tasks, and they'll go do them, I guess. But you can also choose ones that you want to control, and you then all of a sudden take control of them and can perform the mission as one of these soldiers or vehicles or something like this in the game. So the idea here is there are these NPCs and stuff in the game that are doing these particular actions, but you can take control of them at any time. And to what extent is this like an incarnation? Am I incarnating one of these players when I decide to play as them to achieve some specific purpose? That's the analogy I want you to think about, which is a weird thing to think about. So now, of course, with these kinds of things in mind, we can turn to the incarnation of Jesus. if we take God to basically be a simulator as an analogy, right? It seems that it would be possible for God to incarnate himself in the world, both as a part of it and yet in some ways separate from it as well. Like it's a weird thing to think about, but if we take it to be the case that one's virtual body is in some way an extension of their, in our case, it would be a physical body, but if we consider God's physical body on earth to be an extension of his sort of spiritual mind or body, whatever, is this one possibility? And this is where, this is really funny that the Catholic Church took this idea of incarnation and they're just like, look, we're just going to call this a mystery. We're not going to spend a bunch of time trying to decode exactly how these things work. So they say basically the mystery of the incarnation is the mystery of the human person transformed in Christ, which is probably a good way to do it because this is really mind-bending stuff. Like how can your mind be in one place controlling two bodies in two separate places or two separate realms? Really, really weird. Now, once again, I'm not trying to make the argument that this is what happened, that God is a simulator and he, took control of a body called Jesus and used the arrow keys to walk around. I'm not saying this is what happened at all. Rather, I'm saying this is an interesting analogy to think about the possibility that if it's the case that we can incarnate ourselves into our own simulations, that it's at least possible that God as a simulator could do the same in our world. Just once again, as an analogy, as a thought exercise kind of thing, not as saying this is exactly what happened, but this is why we're doing this in terms of simulation theology. This is the fun we get to have here. So once again, I don't want to be, if people are going to be thinking that I'm saying all this heretical stuff, and I'm not trying to do that. I'm trying to just play around with these ideas because they're really interesting, really, really fun to think about, saying if God was a programmer, this is one way we could understand how this could happen in a very intuitive sort of sense from our own experience, incarnating our own virtual worlds. Which leads us to some really interesting big questions here. Once again, if I incarnate myself into a simulation, is my virtual avatar in some ways an extension of my body? This is the first question. And let me know in the comments. Do you think that that's ridiculous? Do you think it has to be physically attached to me and made of flesh and blood for it to be an actual extension of my body? Or is there some blurred boundaries here? I'm curious to know what you guys think. Another question, right? If I kill other avatars in a virtual world, is this like killing part of their body? So if you play, Call of Duty, Fortnite, these sorts of things, and you do accept that in some ways your body is an extension of yourself, are you killing parts of other people when you're actually killing their avatar in a game? It's kind of an interesting way to think about that. I don't want to make the argument that these things are bad or immoral per se. I mean, we give consent all the time, even if this is true, to say we're just playing a game. In fact, you play a game like Tag or Cops and Robbers, even not in a video game, you have the same particular idea. So I'm not trying to make that argument. I'm just trying to say it's an interesting thing to think about. Now, in Hinduism, there's this concept of an avatar. It comes from the Sanskrit. I think I'm not going to try to pronounce it, but avatara, which kind of means descent, which also uses the word incarnation, right? The incarnation of a deity in human or animal form to counteract some particular evil in the world. And I think this is where our term avatar in modern lingo and online language comes from, is this Hindu idea of avatar. And it's really interesting because you can think about this in a similar sort of way. You can think about it as, this is another way to think about it, the incarnation or the temporary suspension of natural order to perform some specific action would be kind of the general idea. In Christianity, of course, in Judaism, we have the idea of God taking on the form of a burning bush to talk to Moses. I mean, that's totally possible when you think of incarnation. You can, if you're the simulator, you can just decide to light a bush on fire in the virtual world and then have it talk to people. These are all possibilities to think about when we're playing around with these sorts of questions. But I will say we need to be careful about the word incarnation because a lot of Christian scholars, I think most of them, are going to distinguish between this particular use of the word incarnation and what in Christology is called a perfect incarnation. Now, not perfect in the necessarily perfect has a lot of connotations here, but what's usually meant by perfect is it's a flesh and blood type of incarnation. A lot of the Christian scholars think that the Hindu types of incarnations are more of a spiritual incarnation as opposed to an actual flesh and blood type of incarnation, but there are lots of debates about these. So I'm not trying to brush that under the rug or try to say that. I just will say that most Christian scholars, they may even accept that some of the Hindu incarnations in this particular sense are completely legitimate, but they would distinguish this from Christological type of incarnation, like Jesus Christ being fully flesh and blood. And this kind of gets into this thing called asceticism, which is the idea that Jesus' body was not completely flesh and blood, the idea that Jesus only had a sort of spiritual body and not a real one. And I will say this is a heretical view. This is, by definition, I don't mean heretical in like a negative way. I mean it in the way that it's by definition textbook heretical. It was deemed heretical. And the reason for this is Christians, we as Christians, those of us who are like, I guess Orthodox Christians, believe that Jesus was completely like plugged into the matrix, so to speak. He was inside of it. It was not, he didn't just have like this fake body and was actually just, it was like illusory. It was like, no, God, by perfect incarnation, we mean God could feel pain and experience death just like any other human would. So once again, this is where our analogies about simulation incarnation are imperfect, because if I'm playing Call of Duty and I shoot somebody or they shoot me, my avatar, I don't actually feel the bullets. I have the experience that I would have the experience of if I was in that simulated experience in that particular way. So as a result, we would say that simulation, Call of Duty, is not a perfect simulation because it does not, my experience outside of the simulation does not mirror what I would experience if I was inside of it. And once again, this idea, as Christians, we do not think about this as God playing arrow keys, as taking control of something like Jesus. We actually think of Jesus being like, his own thing that has been incarnated. But once again, this is just an interesting way to think about these sorts of questions. So that's why I wanted to bring it up. This is one way we can think about the possibility of both the suspension of natural order, but also the intervention of a deity in the natural world. So hope you found this interesting. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think.